Brent Porcio, TopVelocity.net. 3x pitch BioMetrics here at Matt, and we've got him at 76 miles an hour here. Take him into out of his lift into his load position. We're going to be looking at his hip orientation. We can see here, bottom left corner right check mark, he's at 32 degrees of external rotation. That's a good loaded position. Thing is, if you look from the side, you can see the trunk is leaning back, but so is the hip position. So if I pulled up the pelvis orientation, we'd see it's at 14 degrees backwards. Not really loading the posterior chain that well. You need a little forward position with the pelvis, just a little bit, neutral to forward, to really open up the the hamstring. Get that hamstring loaded, the glute more active, and getting you in a good position to hold that load. We want to hold that load because we want to continue to move forward and down. You can see pretty quickly Matt's coming out of this back leg position here. So not getting so far back in your trunk, where you're not in a position to really stabilize the hip. We got to load the posterior chain to be able to do that. Good on staying closed with the front side, but like I said, just not far enough. Like 54 degrees of abduction with the hip is good because you're holding external rotation. You're really going to see those linking together, external rotation and the hip abduction. But just need to keep carrying it more forward and down. Good even knee flexion. Well, maybe not. Maybe there isn't enough. Let's see. Let's check out the knee flexion here. Knee bend and the trailing leg 35. Yeah, not a lot of knee bend. So that's probably why we're not going much forward and down here. We're still pretty extended in the back leg. So it's going to be interesting to watch kinematic sequence along with the linear kinematic sequence. So if we look at the right here, we can see this hip is peaking not even before front foot strike, and the trunk is peaking right after it. So not separation at all. You can see hip and trunk is really moving together. So there really wasn't much of a drive, a linear drive through that back leg, just because that back knee was so extended, trunk was leaning back, there was just this kind of a rotational movement. If we look at the top left corner where we've got peak pelvis speed to peak trunk or chest speed, we can definitely see an increase in a really big increase in speed peak. It's not really telling us directionally. It's just saying that this trunk is accelerating pretty quickly. Let's see, actually the peak is all the way after release. So it's hitting about a 11 here from a 5 at the highest of the hip peaks, which is a good jump, but it's all happening at the same time. So we see the red hump on the left side, and you have the green hump on the chest hump right there with it, just mirroring the kinematic sequence. So there's these high peaks, they're just not carrying over time and not separating that well over time. So that's the key is how can we get more energy over time. So it's got to be in that initial lift coming out of leg lift. It's got to be in carrying more momentum down the mound. It's got to be in sequencing more hip to shoulder separation, so then we can accelerate more energy up the trunk. So if we got to kind of go back to the drawing board here. If we don't get, let me get the tools out. If we don't get the back leg force vector, let me show the leg driver here. If we don't get the back leg force vector linear enough, then we're going to want to just rotate. So if we can't get this vector somewhere to here, so where those hips are down here, okay, then when we generate force back, it's not going to want to push this hip forward. If we look, oh, that didn't clear it. If we look right now, force vector is pretty vertical, so if we generate force, it would just want to push things up. And we're not going to want that to happen. So what we do is we typically just spin. See, things are just rotating. The front side is opening, and there's just pure rotation here. That's why everything's swiveling at that point. So if we don't get that force vector, like I said, down in this more linear position here, when we generate force, we're not going to be able to move things forward. So we'd have a hip going here, and then if this had stayed back, then we would have seen that transfer, and we get all that linear movement. And that's going to be, like I said, not only getting linear, but also getting good at generating force back towards that target. That's where this King of the Hills really help us understanding how to get force back towards the target. So at front foot strike, you got everything going together, and you're also going to see big contralateral tilts, because things that aren't moving forward or guys that aren't accelerating in linear speeds are failing in or they're over accelerating in angular speed. So basically, if we're not going, let me kill this, if we're not going this way really well, sideways really fast, then we start going off to glove side really fast. So that's looking at, if we look at chest orientation, we can see the side bend is 43 degrees. So 43 degrees to the glove side. 25 should be the maximum, because studies show if we go past that, what happens is ball speed stops going up and torques continue to go up. At the same time, too, when we get in a lot of these rotational positions, sometimes there's things are moving sideways, not forward, and you'll see the front foot, the front leg lands in a internal rotated position as opposed to an external. So to see this front leg is at 56 degrees internal, which is a lot just because the hips are so tipped. So look at the hip orientation. If the hip orientation is actually, if I put the tool back up, the hip orientation is this way. So, and then the leg is positioning this way. So 56 degrees is this arch right here. And that it should be actually externally rotated. So that means the front leg is not even in a stable position, because things are just spinning at that point. They're just spinning and everything's flying off. So, and then as you finish, you're not going to see much forward trunk tilts at pitch release, because nothing's really, there's not enough energy there pushing trunk forward. So if we look at the trunk forward, it's at 35, with a pretty extended front leg, vertical front leg. So if we could lower our center of mass and then push us out to 45, 50, then we know we've got to get a lot of linear energy going. This is the key. Getting energy out of the ground, flowing it towards the target, and getting it to releasing the ball is really what we're trying to do here. And when we start going rotational, we can, you could say the sequence is right, hips before trunk, but there's not much of a separation. So we start creating more delays potentially when we generate more linear energy, because we're taking more time to generate energy. And when you take more time, you can create more delay. When you create more delay, you can create a bigger force multiplier, because there's elastic loading in those delays. If we're going more vertical, things don't go as far, so they happen quicker, so it's harder to create those delays and accelerate that energy. So really got to work on initially loading more into that force vector, more knee bend, and then getting more linear drive and enhancing the sequence of hip to shoulder separation and picking up all that big forward trunk tilt.